Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Belo Miguel Cipriani. Belo is the founder of Oleb Media, and I'm so excited to chat with you today to record one of our conversations because I always learn so much when we chat together. Hi, Belo.
Hello.
Yay. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
We are going to dive into digital inclusion and how to go beyond accessibility and lots of fun things like that. Before we do, I want you to tell us a little bit about how you landed in your role today and the work that you do. Anything that was accidental, purposeful along the way?
You know, I would say that the title of this podcast describes my entire career, like it does for many listeners in, L&D, the L&D space. My story really begins back in 2007 when I was in my 20s and working in Silicon Valley. I was living in San Francisco, and I was assaulted by a group of men, and I became blind from the assault. And I went from someone who was working in high tech, who used tech for everything, to someone who was nearly blind and was struggling to write an email with the software that was available at that time. And, there was such a big disconnect that I was noticing that, here I was in, the heart of technology, Silicon Valley, and I was struggling with the technology, for the blind at that point. And, it took many years of me to really hone in, on the fact that I could do something about it. I couldn't just, make an impact, and I could do that, make that change through training and teaching others on how to make things more accessible.
Yeah, that is so amazing that you had this itch, desire, passion to not settle for who knows, whatever this technology. I'm trying to imagine back in 2007, hopefully there's been a transformation. You and I were chatting just before we started recording how there's so many new technologies on the market with AI, and that it seems like a lot of technology moves so quickly these days, and the internet. And I'm so glad to have this conversation with you about digital inclusion, because when we're playing in this space and using this space or relying on it in like a workplace setting, we need to be making sure that we're setting up this environment so it's inclusive to everyone, I imagine. So I think that might be a good place for us to start, is just level setting with some definitions. And I know in another conversation I thought was really interesting is that you differentiated accessibility and digital inclusion. So maybe that's like a place we can start, is if you can help differentiate what that is, why they're different.
Absolutely. I'll start with just giving my definitions, and then kind of give you, some background on how I came to that definition. So I define accessibility as following a very specific recipe, which can come from policy, regional, federal policy from your government that requires you to follow a set of guidelines. Other could be baselines that come from an industry standard on accessibility. And an example that would be like the WCAG guidelines. And so they're both are different baselines that you're using to achieve accessibility. And so it's a lot of that checklist mentality, right? Where you check the box and then you meet a criteria, and you then, the goal is that you achieve accessibility. However, when you're working with these, baselines that come from policy or through an industry guideline, is, you don't always are able to serve everyone. And I experienced this firsthand. And so after I lost my sight and I was rehabilitated, I spent months learning how to use assistive technology. And, I came into this space already being a programmer. I had a, bachelor's degree in computer science. I used to be a sysadmin, a Unix sysadmin. And so I was pretty technical. And so I learned screen readers at that time. That, screen readers were around back then. And I was using JAWS. And I was, very taken aback that I learned all this, took all my classes, being that overambitious student. But when I got to the real world, things were not accessible to me. And there was such a big disconnect to how I was treated versus my colleagues. An example of that is, I got this job at this company. And you have these, new hire orientations when you have an HR person saying, welcome to the company. There's like 10 to 20 of you guys in there. And everyone was handed, a manual with, how to use all the software that they need, all the support whenever they had questions, someone came over. But when it came to me, I was given a paper copy. I wasn't even given a Braille version. And whenever I had questions about how do I get this? How do I do this? And the HR person would just say, well, it's 508 compliant. It's accessible. And there is this disconnect on how, this is not an accessibility thing. It's just a support thing. My colleagues, have MBAs from top universities and they're getting help. Why doesn't it translate to me? And I then began to realize that policy is what really drives these guidelines. And it's really hard to update policy. It takes years and years and years. And so technology changes much quicker. And that's when I started looking at digital inclusion, which is, stepping outside these guidelines. Like once you meet these guidelines, there's other things you could do to serve more people. And that's how I defined it. I find digital accessibility as, meeting guidelines set by a policy or an industry best practice versus digital inclusion is going beyond those to better serve your community.
Yeah, this makes me think of one of our first conversations where you pointed out to me that, and I really appreciated this feedback. I was so grateful. We ran a survey that we created into accessibility checker and it passed and it was not accessible. You played a screen reader. You're like, this is what I'm hearing. We're like, oh, so this is too much information. We've added too much context here and that you're not even getting to hear what you need to fill in the text in this survey form. That was so helpful. And you taught me how to use Narrator on my own device that I use, like a Lenovo laptop. And I now play with that all the time on websites. I just test. I'm like, hey, is this site accessible? What happens? Or just when I'm making something now, that just like it helps me feel so empowered. And I am jumping into this story just because as you were talking about policies, that can feel like I think some people say that it feels overwhelming and they want to make sure that they're getting it right. And with good cause. I mean, there's a lot of organizations now that are getting sued or they're getting handed lawsuits. And so that's like a motivating factor. But I think that there's still some overwhelm. And I think your approach is very empowering. It's acknowledging that like meeting people where they're at. Yes, this can be difficult, but like you need to memorize these policies and these guidelines this way, like thinking you sort of help people think about it in a different way where you can just start and get started right now and start changing the way that you're creating or doing anything online, which I love.
Well, I just want to say that I'm really just beaming because I love it when I'm able to give someone resources that are, actionable. And that's something that I really want to focus on is making accessibility training accessible, because I definitely agree. It's when you look at the criteria, it's very overwhelming, and it's the language is not very clear. And, I was overwhelmed the first time I saw the WCAG guidelines. It was in grad school and, I was working with my advisor on my dissertation, and he says, well, do you want to do digital inclusion? You need to know these, like the back of your hand. And I remember looking at these and I was like, oh my God, what do I do? Should I just drop out of school? it was, so overwhelming. And I am somebody, with, web development experience, someone who's a natural user. And I looked at that and I was overwhelmed. And so, my goal in creating, I created through my grad program, like the digital inclusion sphere, which is, something that I teach in my courses and my training. And it's really looking at these, these policies, these baselines, and do, bite-sized training or doing it in a different way. An example of something like this is I have a methodology of doing some informal testing and then some testing by natural users, which is what you and I talked about. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with someone jumping in and doing some informal testing yourselves, but just know that it's informal testing. At the end of the day, the natural user will really be able to give you the best experience or the best results or the best, data for your training, because they're the ones using, the software in a more natural way. And so I really distinguish those two. However, I mean, just being able to go in there, do some informal testing, that just cuts your quality assurance process in half. And it just makes you, I think, a more conscious trainer.
Yeah, this is reminding me of another conversation we've had where as I've been learning more about accessibility this year, I thought, okay, every organization should they should have a role that's their designated accessibility specialist. And that's going to be the future. Everyone needs that because people need to be held accountable, make sure that they're designing accessible spaces and environments. And I already am deciding now, as I'm learning more, that feels like passing off the work. That doesn't feel like digital inclusion because it means that maybe one person is responsible for like auditing that and almost becomes like a negative connotation maybe versus everyone sort of taking on that ownership and that responsibility, that opportunity, and feeling empowered, like that they know how to do that. So I think that even in having conversations with you and doing a lot of prep for our intensive program and a book, the project that we're working on, it's really been interesting to see my own understanding of this evolve and what it could mean for our ATD community, for anyone who is in a workplace setting and wants to create an inclusive environment.
You said a lot of things that I want to comment on, so let me just unpack a little bit. I think definitely going back to me developing my own methodology for digital inclusion is, when I was in grad school, 10 years ago, I remember being in this, EDD program, Doctor of Education program, and talking about digital inclusion. And the faculty were just like, well, what does that mean? They actually even questioned whether I was in the right program. I was like, no, I want to teach people this. The trainers need to know this. And then they started saying, well, you need to maybe also look at inclusion, look at human resources and borrow from some of those ideas. And it really helped me shape some of my philosophy where when you look at inclusion, companies could have an inclusion officer, right? A diversity officer. But if it's part of their value statement, their vision, like, everyone who they bring on board is an ambassador for inclusion, right? And I think that accessibility, if you look at it from the digital inclusion lens, it's everyone's responsibility, right? And when I talk to people who say, well, I've had people tell me, I don't have any interest in becoming an accessibility expert. And I said, I understand. That's pretty technical stuff. If you don't want to, don't do it. But, as an inclusion ambassador, if that's what you choose to call yourself, or diversity, and you believe in this, that includes technology. And something you could do is just ask. A good ally, ask questions. When you're, hiring a new website designer, assessing, procuring new tools, putting an event, just ask the question is, can someone with a disability, with accessibility, attend this workshop and be successful? Can they navigate our website and buy courses and be successful? Asking these questions, you don't have to be a certified accessibility consultant to ask those questions or get someone to answer those questions for you.
What recommendations do you have for anyone who creates virtual trainings, maybe meetings, maybe they're the host of any type of virtual environment or a digital offering in their organization?
I think that something that I see in my practice, people are coming to me often because they've received a judgment letter and they have an outline, time set by a judge to, remediate their website, their content, their courses. And a lot of, very common, scenario is that, well, I just bought this tool. I used this because they said it was accessible, or someone recommended it, and so I always just, caution people where, just because an organization says, they're accessible or their product's accessible, that not to always assume that it is. What I see happen very often is, for a tech product is that they did an accessibility assessment, maybe 2 years ago, but there's been all these releases, maybe several releases. So the product has changed. And so it's important as professionals using different tools to just make sure that their tools are the best that they can be, and to just really always ask, the vendors, are you accessible? When was your last accessibility, check or assessment? Was it by just an AI automation, or did you actually use testers? And for me, I don't even book a demo with any software company unless their accessibility testing or protocols are less than a year old. Recently I had a tech company, reach out to me and say, hey, would you like to, partner with us? And I asked they had this beautiful accessibility, statement. And when I asked for the paperwork, when I just asked, when was this accessibility review done? And when they told me it was done in 2016, I was like, oh my goodness, no. Because I already know that in 26, oh my God, that's so long ago. So I guess what, my take home, the point I'm trying to make is, inclusion, accessibility is something that you constantly are working on. It's a living organism and you have to maintain it. And I think that's something that's, at least for my clients, the biggest aha moment is that a lot of them, when they put their products together, did a little bit of accessibility testing, but they never followed up with it. So they lost it.
In some ways, I think that there are platforms that are putting out accessibility features that help people who are less tech savvy, where that might be a barrier, is just their proficiency with new technologies and learning their features in general. They're still able to incorporate some accessibility features because they've been built into the platform and they've made it as easy as clicking on a button. And not to say that they're perfect and that they are doing it at maybe the right level, but it's better than not having it. And I think I'm seeing some of these virtual meeting platforms are adding closed captioning. They're adding transcript features, again, because of AI, and not that they're perfect, but I remember it used to be if you wanted to do a virtual webinar and share closed captions inside of Zoom, you as the presenter needed to come up with closed captions in your slides, in Google Slides or in PowerPoint, or it was the onus was on you. And now that if you forget to turn that on in PowerPoint, if the producer has enabled it in Zoom, an individual could turn on closed captions. I just think that some of those things, I see some of the benefits of having some of these features available, but I think you had brought up a recommendation, just being mindful that just because it's there as a feature doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually going to be inclusive to all of your users. Doesn't mean it's actually truly accessible. So I'm just curious if you have any follow-up thoughts for this isn't even really a question. I don't know, just me rambling my thoughts about some of the tech out there right now.
Yeah. So, there's definitely a lot of companies, for whatever reason, some of them there's some needling from, judgments and legalities to offer some type of accessibility feature. Others have been doing it for a long time. And I think that, of course, if someone's been doing it for a long time, it's just better, right?
Yeah.
And so, at least for me, when I'm evaluating products, any tool that I'm using, yeah, they need to have an accessibility feature built in. And something that you want to ask is, how long have you guys been offering this? And is there a way to report bugs? It's something to consider. I think that the point I want to drive is, yeah, some of these accessibility features work really well, and others are really buggy still because they're really new.
Mm.
And so just be mindful that just because you have an accessibility feature, the results, the output may not be the best possible experience. People may still have, problems with it. And this is just something that could, it's going to get better with some companies get really good. I'll use Zoom as an example. I would say a couple of years ago, I wasn't a fan, but during the pandemic, they just really beefed up their accessibility team or support where that they are now my primary choice for me. And there's other options, but if I'm given the option, I would use Zoom. They made it an effort. They really, inclusion was a big part of their brand, and they actually follow their word and their own, vision. And so I think that that's a good example of a company that within very recently just really beefed up their product, and it's wonderful. Other companies who've been around for longer, they're just adding features and they're not that great. They actually cause problems. And that's where I see a lot of disappointment with people in our space who say, bought this tool because they offered this feature, this transcript feature, just to stay on the same topic. And then people can't use it, or it gets in the way, or it fails. It causes error messages sometimes. And so that's something else to consider is sometimes when you're looking at tools and comparing tools, and if they all have accessibility features, what I would recommend is well, which one has been doing it the longest? And that's probably going to be the better tool.
Yeah, you have lots of good questions here. Like, when was your last accessibility review? How long have you been offering this? Is there a way to report bugs? I was starting to wonder about roadmaps. A lot of times that can be a way for an organization to say, we don't have it yet, but that is on our features roadmap that's coming up in the next year. And I think sometimes it can be a way to punt some of it, but it could be also beneficial as well to see they don't have something yet, or they know this bug has been reported and it's in their roadmap in the next 18 months or whatever it is to fix that, enhance that. Is that a conversation that you have with platforms, or is that like a worthwhile route to take in terms of kind of looking into the future for platforms and their accessibility features?
Absolutely. I would say that a lot of our ed tech clients, that's where we come in and help them create an accessibility plan. With a lot of our clients, we're doing, digital inclusion plans, and it's just really helping them get organized and, and understanding how this industry works. As far as, making sure that your tech is updated, and something that's really, crucial is, the being able to report bugs, because they could have a feature, and if you have an error and you could report it, then it gets fixed. You cannot imagine what difference that makes. There's some companies who have accessibility checkers, but then they have an error, and then there's no way to report it. Like, you try to put that through a regular ticket, and they say, well, we're not working on this yet, or there's no way to report it, so it doesn't get fixed.
I love this because you're working with these organizations from the consultant perspective, where you're telling them what their roadmap needs to be. And what I hope is that our listeners, our ATD community, put the pressure on platforms and tools like when they're talking to vendors and suppliers and they're considering what they're going to invest in, that they're saying, hey, I need this, like I want this, and I'm going to be looking for the supplier that offers this feature. So if it's going to be, if it's coming from everywhere, then I feel like there's more likelihood that it's going to happen.
There is power in numbers and client satisfaction, right? And so I would say before the pandemic, I was fighting really hard with a lot of tech companies where I was a vendor. I was giving them money. I was their client and say, this is an an accessibility issue. And there is no way to report it. Or, their traditional support team would say, well, we don't know what to do with this. We'll just add it to our backlog. And it didn't get fixed. And so, at least for me, as a vendor, I was frustrated because there was, it was just my complaints were going into a void. But what I often heard from, my account manager, well, no one else has brought it up. Maybe this is just a you thing. There's a lot of what's called, what I call is forced intimacy or shaming. As a person with a disability, and when you report something, the company often says, well, maybe you're not using it correctly.
User error. Do they say that? Yeah.
They say that a lot. User error, or they say, well, no one else has asked for this. And it just baffles me where it's like, really? No one else has asked for transcripts? Like, really? It's just, it just baffles me. But yeah, no one else has asked for transcript. Maybe you're the only one who needs this. And, I just found it hard to believe that in 2019, I was being the only one that has asked for transcripts. But because there was no accessibility plan, they weren't logging these. So I could see their perspective too, where it's like, if they weren't logging these accessibility errors, then it looked like no one was asking them. Yeah. But if you have a group of people telling their accounts person, their sales rep, I am not signing this until I've offered this feature. I am not renewing because I'm going through this other because of the access feature. That's when I've seen companies make a change.
I'm always taking lots of notes when we're chatting, Belo. These are good stories, good examples. I love this. Man, it seems like in some ways the pandemic was perhaps like a silver lining to help the cause with digital inclusion, because so many people were suddenly forced into a virtual environment that weren't before, that then they had to improve their products, or they had to, now that there more and more people were using them. Or what are your thoughts? You tell me.
The pandemic changed my business completely.
Oh, wow.
When I went into the accessibility space, I had just gotten my doctorate, and I said to myself, I'm going to be one of those fancy smashing consultants, right? And I put a website, and it was crickets. And then I said to myself, I was telling people about accessibility and inclusion, and they would say, that sounds great. But they would say, I don't serve people with disabilities. There was this mindset that, this was only for organizations that serve people with disabilities. And it's like, no, right? But because of that, I said, well, who else is doing it? And so I went into, the hospitality space, because the hospitality space was the first industry that really was pushed to embrace inclusion, or, ADA, at least in the United States, ADA compliance, because they had to retrofit hotel rooms, airlines, restaurants, wheelchair accessible, tables. I mean, they knew. So it was really easy for me to say, hey, is your website ADA compliant? They're like, no, help us, because they've already been through that of having to retrofit, so they understood it. However, when the pandemic hit, I had all these major hotel chains just say, we've ceased,
Yeah.
we can pay you, Belo. And so I was like, okay, well, I was getting all these emails from school districts and universities like, we've got online, we don't know what we're doing, help us. So for me, it changed my business model, the clients that I'm served. I mean, I'm still working with a lot of companies in judgment, and retail, seems to be the biggest, profile for me. But I would say about 40% of my clients now are in the ed tech space. I work with a lot of coaches and instructional designers. And the biggest, they always come to me and say, I'm not a technical person, but how can I still practice inclusion? And I'll let the listeners know that you don't have to be a web programmer to practice digital inclusion. If you want to be an accessibility consultant, then you probably will benefit from some HTML courses, and then that's the whole thing. But what I compare it to is, being, for example, in marketing or in finance, where there's some level of finance that you could do on your own. And then when it gets too big, you need a professional. Like, for example, if you're marketing, if you're a small shop, a small, instructional design company, freelance, Moodle admin, whatever, like you could do a lot of your own social media, but if you blow up, you're going to have to hire a social media manager. That's how I really see accessibility and digital inclusion. I think if you're a small to mid-sized shop, you could do a lot of these things on your own. When it gets really big, then you may have to have an expert to really manage the process. But you still want to be, I would recommend that if you have, if inclusion is important to you, to really get organized and get a plan and talk to experts and learn the basics.
Yeah, that makes me think of the like build, buy, borrow mentality. And I think it's empowering to hear for small, medium-sized businesses, or maybe you're working with a small size budget but you're a bigger organization, whatever it is, that you could do a lot of this work yourself. I want to go back to something you said when you were talking about starting your consultancy business and talking with people, and they said, we don't have people with disabilities. Again, we could like talk about that forever. Just alone, that could be its own themed podcast episode. But I wanted to tap into that for a question that I had about, I always see these statistics about how a lot of people don't disclose their disabilities for any variety of reasons. And if you have thoughts on how that impacts digital inclusion efforts, I'm thinking now, again, like the practical, the tactical, someone who's like, I want to be digitally inclusive. I want to do this in my organization, but I want to protect the anonymity for those who want to stay anonymous. How do we show, what do we do to make sure that we're an inclusive workplace, knowing that we might not be getting information from people who might have like specific accommodation needs, but aren't actually sharing them maybe yet, and this is turning into a long-winded question, so I'm just going to stop.
No worries. It's a great question. And I'll just share how that looks from the perspective of someone with a disability, and it's something that within the disability space or movement, it's called forced intimacy. Whereas a person with a disability, you're being forced to be intimate with a stranger, having to share medical records when it's not necessary.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. 3 weeks ago, a theater near me had this production of this play that I really wanted to go, listen to. And, I bought tickets, and then I said, do you have accessibility needs? Check this box. And I checked that box. And then I get this questionnaire that was asking me, when was your last medical report? Who's your doctor? When were you diagnosed? And I'm just like, I just need descriptive audio. Do you have, why do I need to share my medical record? And so that is something that I want to just bring to light, because that's really what it is forced intimacy. You're forcing someone to be intimate with their details that, if you just offer this, this service, they don't even have to, right? And so this is one of the reasons why my training, the services that I do really focus on digital inclusion. Digital inclusion by default, in my opinion, you're already doing accessibility, but you're trying to do beyond that, right? Because like you said, some people don't identify because of the forced intimacy. They don't want to be asked for additional information because that's a lot what happens. And they're fearful. And so if you just give people options, I'm a big fan of giving people options, because then people have an option to partake or not partake, and then you serve the most people, possible. So I'll give an example of that is with PDFs. PDFs, according to accessibility best practices, it could be made accessible, and that's all you need. But then there's some people who can't have Adobe Acrobat for whatever reason. Maybe they're low income, they're using a flip phone. Maybe, there's just so many reasons, and it doesn't matter. What really matters is that a Word document or a Word document would serve them better. And so by you offering, say, the application to your program, hey, here's a PDF or a Word document, you choose whatever, you're letting people then accommodate themselves. which is a big part of learning, and I borrow a big part of that comes from universal design is you give people options. And I think with digital inclusion, that is what's going to provide, learners the best option where they could move around and pick their own choices. And I'll say sometimes for me, there's sometimes where I just download the PDF because I'm in that mental, I'm neurodivergent. As I said earlier, I lost my sight from an assault. So I had some, traumatic brain injury. And so sometimes, I'm able to handle the PDF, which is a more robust application, more commands, to never, but sometimes I'm tired, I'm fatigued and I just need a Word document. And I don't have to explain that to people. I'm so happy when I see that option, and that's just one of many options, the thing about digital inclusion too is that you're also able to serve people with chronic illness a lot better, because a lot of those people don't identify as disabled. They have a chronic illness that, they move around. Sometimes symptoms are very acute and sometimes they're not existent, right? They're not going to fill out an accessibility form, but they do benefit from some of these accessibility features or this digital inclusion tactics of, offering, video transcripts. I think that's a big one that help everyone. And I'll point back to the example of, automatic doors at retail stores, right? Automatic doors were meant to help people who have mobility issues, primarily, wheelchair users, but who hasn't benefited from automatic doors, right? Isn't it just great? It just opens, and whether you need it or not, it works.
Again, I'm always just taking notes. There's so much good stuff here. I have so many follow-up thoughts that I'm wondering if it's even worth it to go into, but just like creating options. And then I'm sure people trying to put myself in the shoes of our listeners where maybe they're thinking now, okay, so now I need to do like a PDF and a Word doc option, but I need to make sure that this is in a secure place where it's like it would be okay to release this. But I feel like those are small technical things that they could work out. A lot of people have all of their materials and things like built into some secure place or location, firewall location anyways. But it does make me think just how, going back to just things with the pandemic, just the folks who there is this digital divide with people who might not have like reliable internet or power, just certain things where like if you're in a rural location or there's like just a lot of trees around, and how it would be helpful to have these different options, like you're saying, giving people options for when you're not in your normal location, or if that is your normal location and you don't always have reliable internet. Lots of things to think about.
Or when the symptoms to your condition are severe, but you still have to show up.
Oh, well, of course, yes, that.
Another point to bring that I want to, talk about is assistive technology is very expensive. And sometimes people, receive money to get these devices through grants, or they're working through some rehabilitation, and then that ends, and then they're responsible for buying their own equipment afterwards. And it takes a while. I'll use myself as an example. When I was in grad school, through the rehabilitation program I was working with in California, they paid for, my Braille display. The Braille display is a tablet that, you connect it to your laptop. It has a USB connection, and it renders, what's on the screen in Braille, and the dots move, which, someone who used to be sighted, and when I felt the dots move, I felt like I was in an Indiana Jones movie, and I was like, the magical tablet, it was just so fascinating to see the text move. I still think it's magical for me. Well, my Braille display broke. It was something like $9,000, and I had to buy a new one on my own with my own business. And it took me, some time to save for that.
Yeah.
And so within that year that I didn't have that tool, I was asking for things that I hadn't asked for before. My doctor's office, or, different organizations that I was involved with. They're like, well, you didn't need that before. Why do you need this now? And, should we, it's just, then I had to explain that this broke. And it was the forced intimacy, right? And again, it went back to the Word document, right?
Yeah.
I don't have this device. Can you just give me a Word document? The PDF is too complicated to use with this device. And they were just like, well, you didn't ask for that before. And I'm just like, if you guys just create a Word document, We don't even have to have this conversation. Like I was having meetings just for a Word document, right? And so again, and it was because of this device that was so expensive, it took me a year to get a new one.
It's funny because most people, maybe I'm making this assumption wrongly, but I feel like most PDFs start off as a Word document anyways. So it exists. So it's easy enough to share. I know we could keep talking about all sorts of things. I want to jump to a question, and also just thank you for sharing all of these your personal stories that just really help give us the perspective, and just I'll always love talking to you, and I appreciate you, Belo.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you, for folks that are listening, how can they get started with digital inclusion today?
I think it's a mind. The first step is it's a mind paradigm shift for many. What I'd say is like you don't have to become a certified accessibility consultant to practice digital inclusion. There's very few things you could do, and the number one thing you could do is just ask questions. Is this accessible? When was it last tested? Are there more accessible options? I think those three questions would allow you to be a good ally to people with disabilities, and allows you to practice digital inclusion. And then you'll see how these companies react, and then you'll see a new side of them. For me, there was companies that I was using when I was sighted, and then when I became blind, they treated me completely different. And I've seen some of my clients say, you know what, I've been using this product and they were great. And as soon as I asked them these questions, they acted in a way that I don't want to do business with them anymore.
Yeah, those are great recommendations. I definitely think anyone listening here is going to have a good mindset shift. They haven't already. I feel like we talked a little bit about this, just sort of like what's up and coming. I wanted you to give a little mention to, we were talking about new techs when we started, before we hit record, and you were talking about virtual reality. I was asking you about AI. And I had said when we started, I was like, I want to make sure we do some of this foundational stuff first and not just like jump into the new tech like that's around the corner. But let's say that folks do get started with some of this digital inclusion work. They're starting to do some things like color contrast and alt text descriptions or whatever it is. Can you tell us a little bit about the next level?
I think something to keep in mind is that, accessibility and digital inclusion, these are fields in their own right. 10 years ago, when I was telling people I was focusing my research into digital inclusion, people would retort and, something like, well, do robots need inclusion now? And I'm like, no, it's not about robots. And I just used to laugh, but now it's actually really getting there, where now I'm doing, things with AI and machine learning and virtual reality and making those spaces accessible. I have a client who is they offer an MBA program, and they have the ethics course, which is, done through a virtual reality, program, and we're making that accessible. And we've had great results, and the students with disabilities are very happy. And so what I would say is people starting out with color contracts, alt text, some of the foundational pieces, just know that because technology is always changing, there's going to be new things to learn, and even myself, I'm learning new things all the time. 3 years ago, when, we do social media accessibility for some of our clients, and we were all about Instagram. And now last year, 6 months ago, we're all about TikTok. And now everyone's like going back to YouTube. And then just recently, I had something like 12 clients. It was really bizarre. I thought it was like one of those like Freaky Fridays or something, where I had 12 emails all asking for the same thing. They were all asking for email marketing help, making that accessible. And so what I've seen is that whatever hot new tool or tech is out there, you have to make it accessible. And I think that, for anyone who does want to become an accessibility consultant or build that, accessibility expertise as a subcategory of their instructional design or training skills, there's just so much opportunity.
Awesome. Okay, let's put in a pin in it for now and switch gears as we start to wrap up. Will you share what are some of you're already started talking about it a little, I guess, if you have like learning goals or anything that you're working on to get yourself out of your comfort zone these days?
I have my own press, which is Oleb Books, and we publish writers with disabilities. And something that I've seen a lot is how many books are inaccessible. And that's something that as instructional designers, there's so many, programs that are developing their own books, ebooks, right? I mean, so many people offering ebooks just to get on their newsletter. And so many of those are inaccessible and people are even unaware. And so something that I'm really working on over the next 6 months is building a course around ebook accessibility, because anyone creating content, they're often creating ebooks and those are not accessible.
Yeah.
And so that's something that it's been a passion for me, book accessibility. And it's something that I'm realizing that it's a big gap. I don't know anyone else talking about it, but it's such a big problem. I took a course last week and it came with an ebook and, I couldn't read it. And so I think that's my focus for the next 6 months. And I'm sure something else will come up after that.
Oh, I love it. That sounds really cool. Like it will be a very helpful course for folks. Yeah, it seems like everyone offers ebooks these days. Smart. All right. Well, where can folks find you and keep up with your activity? I'm going to share these in our show notes for folks.
Yeah, people could check out my firm's website at olebmedia.com. And then my firm, we're most active on LinkedIn. So we have Oleb Media LinkedIn page, and we share weekly tips on digital inclusion and specifically on how to make your, courses more accessible. And something that I'm very happy about is that, the last 2 years, we made the commitment that we're only serving coaches, trainers, and instructional designers. And so our tagline is the go-to accessibility resource for course and content creators. I could promise that it's not going to be like other accessibility places where you go and they're talking about HTML and it's all actionable. Yeah, there's no development. It's all things that, someone with no tech skills could start implementing immediately.
Awesome. Yay. Well, thank you so, so much. Again, I think I've already said it like 1,000 times in this just one conversation, but I always love talking to you. I always have a page full of notes and learn so much. And I'm grateful for you for sharing all these insights with the ATD community today.
Thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun.